My sister hit our mother so hard she fell down and said, "I should have done this 20 years ago." The sound echoed through the Thanksgiving dinner with 14 family members frozen at the table watching my mother hold her face on the floor. My sister Grace stood over her with her hand still raised and shaking. "Get up," Grace said in a voice I'd never heard her use before. Mom stayed on the floor crying, but something about her crying seemed wrong, like she was performing it. "Grace, what the hell?" Our brother James jumped up from his chair, knocking over his wine. But Grace didn't look at him. She kept staring at Mom. "Tell them what you just told me in the kitchen. Tell them right now." Mom tried to crawl away, but Grace grabbed her arm, not hard, but firm enough to stop her. "Tell them or I will." That's when I noticed Grace's husband, Kevin, wasn't at the table. He'd been here 20 minutes ago helping carve the turkey. "Where's Kevin?" I asked, and Grace's face crumbled for just a second before going hard again. "Mom knows where Kevin is. Don't you, Mom?" Our Aunt Linda tried to intervene, reaching for Grace, but our cousin Tony stopped her. "Wait, let her talk." Tony was a paramedic and had this way of reading situations. Mom finally sat up and wiped her face, but the tears had already stopped. "I don't know what you're talking about." She said it in her sweet victim voice, the one she used whenever someone called her out on anything. Grace laughed, but it sounded like breaking glass. "You sent him those messages. Pretending to be me. You've been texting my husband for 3 months pretending to be me." James looked confused. "What messages? What are you talking about?" Grace pulled out her phone and showed James something that made his face change. Then she showed it to Tony. Then to me. The messages were sexual, explicit, asking Kevin to meet at hotels, saying their marriage was over, saying Grace wanted a divorce. All from a number that looked almost like Grace's, but off by 1 digit. I found them on Kevin's phone today when he was showering. He thought he'd been texting me about problems in our marriage. He thought I wanted to leave him. He's been sleeping in his car for a week because these messages told him not to come home. Grace's voice was breaking now. Mom stood up and brushed off her dress. "That's ridiculous. I don't even know how to do that technical stuff." But Grace had more. "The phone number is registered to your credit card, Mom. I checked with the phone company an hour ago. You bought a burner phone and have been paying $40 a month for it." The table was completely silent now. Aunt Linda looked sick. "Louise, why would you do that?" Mom's mask slipped for just a second, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Pure hatred looking at Grace. She doesn't deserve him. She trapped him with pregnancy. My beautiful, successful daughter reduced to a housewife. Grace's son was 4 years old, and she'd quit her job as a nurse to raise him while Kevin worked. It had been their mutual decision. "You tried to destroy my marriage because I chose to raise my own child?" Grace stepped closer to Mom again. "You've been telling Kevin I was cheating, that I had a boyfriend. That's why he believed the messages were real." I remembered Kevin acting strange at the last few family dinners. Not sitting next to Grace, leaving early, looking miserable. We'd all assumed they were having problems. The private investigator found something else. Grace said, and Mom's face went white. "What private investigator?" James asked. "The one Kevin hired 2 months ago to follow me, to catch me cheating. Except instead of finding me with another man, he found Mom meeting with Bradley. Bradley was Grace's ex from college who'd stalked her for 2 years after they broke up. She'd had to get a restraining order." "You contacted my stalker? You brought him back into my life?" Grace's voice was rising now. Mom tried to walk toward the door, but Tony blocked her. "We're not done here, Louise," he said calmly. "The police are already on their way." That's when Mom lost it completely. She took him from me. Kevin was supposed to be mine. He came to me first at that party 6 years ago. We talked all night until she showed up in that slutty dress and stole him. Everyone at the table looked disgusted. James stood up. "Mom, Kevin is 32. You're 58. What the hell is wrong with you?" Mom turned on him. "You always take her side. Everyone always takes perfect Grace's side. She gets everything she wants." Grace pulled out a folder from her bag. The private investigator found more. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Grace's hand shook as she pulled more papers from the folder and spread them across the table next to the turkey that nobody was eating anymore. I leaned closer and saw photos printed in color on regular printer paper. Bradley standing outside a house I recognized as Grace's. Bradley sitting in a car across the street. Bradley walking past the preschool where Scarlett went 3 mornings a week. Each photo had a date and time stamped in the corner, and they went back almost a month. My stomach turned over because this wasn't just Mom being controlling or manipulative anymore. This was dangerous. This was Mom putting Grace's actual life at risk by bringing back the man who used to follow her home from work. and leave notes on her car and show up at her apartment at 2 in the morning until the police finally made her get a restraining order. Tony picked up one of the photos, and his face went hard in that professional way he had when he was working an emergency. He pointed at the timestamp on a photo showing Bradley outside the preschool. The date was October 23rd at 9:15 in the morning, which was exactly when Grace dropped Scarlett off every Tuesday and Thursday. Mom had given Bradley Grace's daughter's schedule. Grace made a sound like she couldn't breathe, and James grabbed her arm to steady her, but she yanked away from him. The front door opened, and everyone's head snapped toward the sound. Kevin stood in the doorway with his coat still on and his keys in his hand. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days, which he probably hadn't if he'd been sleeping in his car. His eyes went to Mom first, still on the floor near the door, then to Grace standing by the table with tears on her face, then to the photos spread across the table next to the mashed potatoes. He walked closer without saying anything and picked up one of the photos. His face changed as he looked at it. Really looked at it and understood what he was seeing. He picked up another photo, then another, and I watched all the color drain out of his face until he looked sick. Kevin set the photos down carefully like they might break and turned to look at Mom. She tried her victim face again with the big sad eyes and the trembling lip, but Kevin just stared at her. Grace was watching him, and I could see her trying to read his face, trying to figure out if he believed her now, or if he still thought she was lying. Kevin's hands curled into fists at his sides and he opened his mouth, but nothing came out at first. Finally, he said Mom's name, just her first name, in a voice so flat and cold it made me shiver. Mom started to speak, but Kevin held up one hand to stop her and she actually shut up, which never happened. Kevin picked up his phone from his pocket and started scrolling through something, and his jaw got tighter and tighter. He turned the phone toward Grace and showed her the screen, and even from where I stood, I could see it was text messages. The fake messages Mom had sent pretending to be Grace. Grace looked at the phone, then at Kevin, and her face just crumbled. Not the angry kind of breaking from before, but something worse, like watching someone's heart actually crack open. She started crying for real now, with her whole body shaking and her hands covering her face. Kevin took one step toward her, then stopped like he'd hit an invisible wall. His hands were still in fists, and I couldn't tell if he wanted to hug her or punch something or both. The space between them felt huge, even though they were only maybe 6 feet apart. Grace dropped her hands from her face and looked at Kevin, and he looked back at her, and nobody else in the room existed for those few seconds. I could see everything they weren't saying written all over their faces. Her asking if he believed her now. Him trying to figure out how he could have been so stupid. Both of them trying to understand how they'd gotten here. Kevin's face twisted up and he turned away from Grace and walked to the window. His shoulders were shaking and I realized he was crying too. James started to say something, but Tony grabbed his arm and shook his head. We all just stood there in this horrible silence while Grace and Kevin fell apart in the same room, but couldn't even touch each other. That's when we heard the sirens. Mom's face changed again, dropping the victim act completely, and now she just looked scared. Tony moved to block the front door without even thinking about it, which made sense since he dealt with situations like this all the time in his job. The sirens got louder and then stopped right outside, and we heard car doors slamming. Someone knocked hard on the door and said police. Tony opened it, and 2 officers came in, looking around at all of us frozen in this weird, horrible tableau. One officer was older with gray hair, and the other was younger, maybe 30. They both had that calm, professional look like they'd seen everything before. The older officer asked who called, and Tony said he did. The officer looked at Mom still on the floor, then at Grace crying by the table, then at all the photos spread out like evidence at a crime scene. He asked if everyone could please move to separate rooms so they could take statements. The younger officer started directing people, and I ended up in the kitchen with Tony, while other family members got sent to different parts of the house. Through the doorway, I could see into the living room where they'd put Mom on the couch. She sat perfectly straight with her hands folded in her lap, and her victim face back on full force. She pulled a tissue from her purse and dabbed at her eyes, even though I could see from where I stood that her eyes were completely dry. The tissue thing was just performance, just like the crying on the floor had been performance. The older officer sat across from her with a notebook and started asking questions. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see Mom's mouth moving in that sweet, innocent way she had. Probably telling them Grace was unstable or going through something or making up lies. The officer's face stayed neutral and professional as he wrote things down. In the kitchen, Tony sat at the table with his arms crossed, and I sat across from him. The younger officer came in and introduced himself and asked me to tell him what happened. I started from the beginning with Grace hitting Mom and the sound it made and everyone freezing. I told him about the fake phone messages and the burner phone and Bradley. I told him about the photos. The officer wrote everything down and asked specific questions about times and dates and who said what. He asked if I'd seen the messages myself, and I said yes, Grace had shown them to me. He asked if I knew Bradley, and I explained about the stalking years ago and the restraining order. When I mentioned the restraining order, his eyebrows went up and he wrote something down with more pressure on the pen. He asked where the photos were, and I pointed to the dining room. He went to look at them and came back with a few in his hand, studying the timestamps. He asked if I knew whether the restraining order was still active, and I said I thought it was, but Grace would know for sure. He thanked me and said I could wait here and went to talk to his partner. Through the doorway, I watched them conferring in low voices while Mom sat on the couch, still dabbing her dry eyes with that tissue. The older officer's expression changed as his partner showed him the photos and pointed at something. They both looked at Mom, and her face flickered for just a second before going back to victim mode. They asked her something and she shook her head. They asked something else and she started crying harder with her shoulders shaking. But I'd seen her real crying earlier when Grace confronted her, and this wasn't it. This was acting. The officers seemed to see it too because their faces stayed professional and unmoved. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, the officers finished taking statements from everyone. They came back to the living room where they'd gathered us all again. The older officer said they were investigating allegations of stalking, harassment, and identity theft. He said they'd need to take the phone records and photos as evidence. He looked at Mom and said they'd be in touch and she should expect to hear from the district attorney's office. Mom's victim face finally cracked and she stood up fast. She said this was ridiculous and her children were ganging up on her and she hadn't done anything wrong. The officer just looked at her with that flat professional expression and said she might want to contact a lawyer. Mom started to walk toward the door, but the younger officer stepped in front of her politely and said she needed to stay until they were finished. She sat back down hard on the couch and her hands were shaking, but not in a sad way. In an angry way. The officers took photos of the evidence with their phones and put the papers in plastic bags they got from their car. They took Grace's statement last in the dining room, and I could hear her voice shaking as she told them everything. When they were done, they told everyone they could leave but to stay available for follow-up questions. The older officer pulled Grace aside and gave her a card with a number for victim services. He said she should call them first thing in the morning and make sure the restraining order against Bradley was still valid, and if not, get a new one immediately. He said the photos showed clear evidence of stalking, and they'd be picking Bradley up for questioning. Grace nodded and took the card, but her hands were shaking so hard she almost dropped it. The officers left and suddenly the house felt too quiet. People started gathering their coats and bags and leaving without saying much. Nobody knew what to say. Aunt Linda hugged Grace hard before she left and whispered something I couldn't hear. Tony squeezed my shoulder and said to call if we needed anything. James stood by the door looking lost, like he didn't know whose side he was supposed to be on anymore. Mom tried to leave too, but Grace blocked her path. Grace's voice came out steady now, not crying anymore. She said Mom needed to leave and never contact her again. She said if Mom came near her house or her daughter or her husband, she'd call the police. Mom tried to argue, but Grace just turned her back and walked away. Dean finally spoke up for the first time all night and told Mom they should go. They left through the front door and I watched through the window as they got in their car. Mom's victim face was completely gone now, replaced by something cold and hard. Kevin stood by the window watching them leave too. When their car pulled away, he turned and looked at Grace. She looked back at him, and they just stood there staring at each other across the living room that still smelled like turkey and gravy. Kevin opened his mouth like he was going to say something, but then closed it. He grabbed his coat from the chair and headed for the door. Grace called his name and he stopped but didn't turn around. She asked where he was going and he said his brother's place. Not his car this time, at least. Grace asked if he was coming back and Kevin didn't answer for a long time. Finally, he said he didn't know and walked out. I stayed with Grace that night because she shouldn't be alone. We cleaned up the dinner that nobody ate, throwing away plates of cold food. Grace moved like a robot, just going through motions. We didn't talk much. Scarlett was already asleep upstairs, having spent the evening at a neighbor's house, thank God. Around midnight, I found Grace sitting on the floor of Scarlett's bedroom watching her daughter sleep. Grace's voice came out as a whisper when she said she didn't know how to explain this to a 4-year-old. How do you tell a little kid that Grandma can't visit anymore? That Daddy doesn't live here right now? That the family she knew just exploded into pieces? I sat down next to her on the floor, and we stayed there until almost 2 in the morning just watching Scarlett breathe in her sleep. 2 days later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice said this was Thea Wallace, the private investigator. She said she found something in Mom's phone records that involved me specifically, and could we meet for coffee? My stomach dropped straight through the floor because suddenly I was remembering things I hadn't thought about in years. My college boyfriend breaking up with me junior year out of nowhere. He said someone who cared about me had told him I was cheating. He wouldn't say who. I spent months trying to figure out what I'd done wrong, never once thinking someone had lied to him. I met Thea at a coffee shop near my apartment the next morning. She was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had a folder with her and slid it across the table before I'd even ordered. I opened it and saw printouts of text messages. Messages from a number I didn't recognize, sent to a number that made my chest tight because I remembered it. That was the number my college boyfriend had before he switched carriers. The messages said I was sleeping with my study partner. They included photos of me having coffee with him at the campus library. The photos were taken from far away through windows like surveillance photos. The messages said I'd been lying about staying late to study and was actually meeting up with this other guy. My study partner's name was right there in the messages. Details about where we met and when. All lies but detailed enough to sound real. Thea pointed to the phone number the messages came from and showed me the records. It was registered to a prepaid account bought with Mom's credit card 3 years ago. The same credit card she used for the burner phone to text Kevin. Mom had done this before. She'd been doing this for years. I sat there staring at those photos of myself at 19, having innocent coffee with a classmate while my mother took creepy surveillance photos and sent them to my boyfriend with lies attached. Thea said there was more. She pulled out another stack of papers showing Facebook messages from a fake profile. The profile had used a stock photo of some random woman and claimed to be a concerned friend. The messages to my boyfriend were even more explicit, claiming I'd confessed to cheating and was just using him. The profile disappeared 2 days after my boyfriend broke up with me. I remembered that breakup so clearly. Sitting in his dorm room while he told me he knew what I'd been doing. Me confused and trying to understand what he meant. Him getting angrier because he thought I was playing dumb. Me crying and begging him to tell me what he was talking about. Him finally showing me one photo on his phone before deleting it. A photo of me with my study partner. I'd thought he was just jealous and insecure. I'd spent years thinking I'd dated someone who didn't trust me. Never knowing my own mother had destroyed that relationship on purpose. I drove to James's house without calling first. I needed to know if Mom had done this to him too. I found him on his back porch at 11 in the morning with a beer in his hand, even though it was a Tuesday. He looked surprised to see me, then resigned like he knew why I was there. I sat down next to him and asked if Mom had ever messed with his relationships. James took a long drink of his beer and stared at his backyard for a while before answering. He said Sarah was staying at her sister's house. They were separated. Not officially, but separated. Sarah was tired of him defending Mom, tired of him making excuses, tired of him choosing his mother over his wife. James said he couldn't stop thinking about his ex-fiancée who broke up with him right before he was going to propose. Her name was Rachel, and they'd been together 3 years. One day she came to his apartment crying and showed him photos someone had sent her. Photos that supposedly proved he was still sleeping with his ex-girlfriend. James said the photos were fake, or at least misleading. They showed him hugging his ex, but it was at a mutual friend's wedding, and it was just a friendly hug. But someone had taken that photo and others like it and sent them to Rachel with messages saying he was cheating. Rachel broke up with him that night. He never found out who sent the photos because they came from an anonymous email that got deleted. James looked at me, and his eyes were red like he'd been crying or drinking or both. He said Sarah told him yesterday that Mom had called her 3 months ago. Mom told Sarah that James was having an emotional affair with a coworker. Mom said she was worried about their marriage and thought Sarah should know. That's when the trust issues started. That's when Sarah started questioning where James was and who he was texting. That's when their marriage started falling apart. James said he'd been getting weird emails for years from anonymous accounts. Emails warning him about people in his life. Warning him that friends were talking behind his back. Warning him that coworkers were trying to sabotage him. He always thought it was spam or some internet troll. Now he was wondering if every single one came from Mom. I went back to Grace's house that night after the police finished taking statements. The house felt empty, even though Grace and I were both there sitting at her kitchen table. She kept opening and closing her phone like she wanted to text someone but couldn't figure out who. I asked if she'd heard from Kevin, and she shook her head without looking up. The silence between us felt heavy and wrong. We'd never been the kind of sisters who didn't know what to say to each other. Grace finally put her phone down and told me she needed to go back to work. She'd been doing occasional shifts at the hospital to keep her nursing license active, and she had one scheduled in 2 weeks. I didn't understand why she was thinking about work right now, but I just nodded. 2 weeks passed in this weird fog where none of us really talked to each other. James stopped answering my calls. Dad stayed at a hotel downtown. Grace texted me once to say Kevin was still at his brother's place. Then Grace called me at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday, sounding panicked. Bradley had shown up at the hospital. She was working the night shift in the emergency room, and he just walked in through the main entrance like he had every right to be there. Security got him out before he reached her floor, but not before he told the front desk person that Grace wanted to see him again. That Louise had told him Grace missed him and wanted to reconnect. Grace was shaking so hard when she got home that she couldn't hold her coffee cup. I drove over and found her sitting on her front porch even though it was freezing outside. She kept saying Mom was still doing this. still trying to hurt her even after everything that happened at Thanksgiving. The police investigation was ongoing, but apparently that wasn't stopping Mom from contacting Grace's stalker and sending him to her workplace. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived at my apartment. The return address was from some law firm downtown I'd never heard of. Inside was a letter on fancy letterhead from Louise's lawyer. I read it twice before I understood what it was saying. The lawyer claimed Mom was suffering from early-onset dementia, that she wasn't in her right mind during the incidents, that she needed medical help, not criminal prosecution. I drove straight to Grace's house without calling first. She was in her kitchen making lunch for her daughter when I walked in and threw the letter on her counter. Grace picked it up and read it while I watched her face go from confused to red. She threw the letter across the kitchen hard enough that it hit the refrigerator. Then she screamed that Mom was lucid enough to pay a burner phone bill for 3 months. Lucid enough to track Kevin's location and plan meetings with Bradley. Lucid enough to create fake social media profiles and send messages at specific times. She could cut the confused elderly woman act because nobody was buying it. Grace called Thea the private investigator that same afternoon. She asked Thea to set up a meeting with Kevin. Somewhere neutral with Thea there as a third party. It took another week before Kevin agreed. We met at a coffee shop across town from where Grace and Kevin lived. The kind of generic place with uncomfortable chairs and bad lighting. Kevin looked terrible. He'd lost weight and had dark circles under his eyes like he wasn't sleeping. Grace sat across from him, and I sat at a different table close enough to hear, but far enough to give them space. Thea sat next to Grace with her notebook open, even though she wasn't writing anything. Kevin started talking before Grace could say anything. He told her he believed the fake messages so easily because Louise had been telling him for months that Grace seemed distant and unhappy. Little comments here and there about how Grace wasn't herself lately. How she seemed distracted when Kevin talked to her. How she'd mentioned feeling trapped at home with their daughter. Kevin said Louise planted all these seeds of doubt over family dinners and phone calls. So when the texts started coming from that number saying Grace wanted a divorce, it seemed possible. It seemed like maybe Grace had finally admitted what Louise had been hinting at for months. Grace stared at Kevin for a long time before she spoke. She told him she didn't know if she could forgive him for doubting her so completely. For hiring a private investigator to follow her instead of just asking her directly what was wrong. For sleeping in his car for a week rather than coming home to talk to her face to face. Kevin said he didn't know if he could forgive himself either. His voice cracked when he said it, and then they were both just sitting there crying in the middle of a Starbucks. Thea quietly pushed the tissue box across the table toward them. I watched from my table and felt this overwhelming anger at Mom for destroying something that had been good. Grace and Kevin had been happy before this. They'd been one of those couples that actually liked each other. I needed to talk to Dad. He'd been avoiding all of us since Thanksgiving, and that needed to stop. I drove to his office the next day without calling ahead because I knew he'd make an excuse not to see me. His secretary tried to stop me, but I walked past her desk and straight into his office. Dad looked up from his computer, surprised and guilty. I closed the door behind me and asked him why he let this happen. Dad started with the same excuses about not knowing Mom would go this far. About thinking she was just difficult and possessive but not dangerous. I lost it on him then. I told him his job as a husband and father was to imagine it could go this far. His job was to stop it before it destroyed his children's lives. Dad's face crumpled and he looked old suddenly. Older than I'd ever seen him look. He told me Louise had an obsession with Kevin from the moment Grace brought him to a family dinner 6 years ago. Dad had caught Mom going through Grace's phone multiple times looking at photos of Kevin. He'd found her texting Kevin directly under the pretense of planning family events, but the messages were too friendly, too personal. Dad convinced himself it was harmless maternal concern, rather than the dangerous thing it actually was. He said he was realizing now that his silence made him part of everything that followed. He'd chosen to look away instead of protecting his daughter, and now he had to live with that choice. The next family gathering happened at James's house a week later. It was supposed to be just a casual dinner, but nobody felt casual about anything anymore. I was helping clean up in the kitchen when our aunt pulled me aside. She wanted to talk somewhere private, so we went out to James's garage. She told me she'd warned Dad years ago that Louise's behavior toward Grace's boyfriends was wrong and controlling. She described things from when Grace was in high school. Times when Mom would flirt with Grace's dates or find reasons they weren't good enough. How Mom would dress younger when Grace brought boys home. How she'd position herself between Grace and whatever guy she was seeing. I felt sick listening to it. This pattern had been going on for decades, and everyone just accepted it as Louise being Louise. Nobody stopped her. Nobody protected Grace from her own mother. The prosecutor called Grace about a month after Thanksgiving. I was at her house when her phone rang, and I watched her face change as she listened. The prosecutor explained they were charging Louise with stalking, harassment, and identity theft. The penalties could include jail time, but more likely probation given her age and clean record. Grace thanked the prosecutor and hung up. She told me later she didn't even care about punishment anymore. She just wanted Mom to stay away from her family forever. She wanted to know her daughter was safe and that Mom couldn't reach Kevin or manipulate any of them again. Kevin moved back home on a trial basis after they'd been apart for a month. Grace told me he was sleeping in the guest room while they tried to figure out if their marriage could survive this. Their daughter asked why Daddy was sleeping in the wrong room now. Grace had to explain in 4-year-old terms that sometimes grown-ups need space to fix their feelings. That Daddy still loved her, but Mommy and Daddy needed time to remember how to trust each other. I came over for dinner one night and watched them move around each other carefully like they were afraid of breaking something fragile. James showed up at my apartment at 2 in the morning about 6 weeks after Thanksgiving. He was drunk and crying and could barely stand up straight. I let him in and made him sit on my couch while I got him water. He told me his wife had filed for separation that afternoon. She'd found out he'd been in contact with Louise through secret email accounts. James said he didn't know why he couldn't just cut Mom off completely. He kept making these excuses for her in his head, even though he knew what she'd done to Grace. Even though he knew she'd probably done similar things to him over the years. I sat next to him and realized he'd been manipulated his entire life. He was so twisted up by Mom's gaslighting that he still thought he owed her something despite everything she'd done to our family. I started seeing a therapist 2 weeks after James showed up drunk at my apartment. Grace had been pushing me to go, saying we all needed help processing what Mom had done, but I kept putting it off because admitting I needed therapy felt like admitting Mom had won somehow. My first session was in a small office with beige walls and a couch that smelled like lavender, and the therapist asked me to describe my relationship with my mother. I started talking about the Thanksgiving incident, and she stopped me. She wanted to know about before that, about my childhood, about how Mom treated me growing up. I realized I didn't have many good memories that didn't involve Mom somehow ruining them, or making them about her. The therapist wrote something down and asked if I'd ever noticed Mom sabotaging my relationships. I told her about Noah and the fake Facebook profile, and she asked if there were others. I sat there trying to remember, and suddenly it was like a dam breaking. My high school boyfriend who got anonymous letters saying I was cheating. My college roommate who moved out suddenly after Mom visited and told her I'd been talking behind her back. The job opportunity in another state that fell through after the hiring manager said someone called with concerns about my reliability. I'd spent years thinking I was the problem, that something about me pushed people away, and now I was seeing it was her the whole time. The therapist said Mom's behavior fit the pattern of a narcissistic parent who saw her children as extensions of herself rather than separate people. She explained that when I started forming my own relationships and identity, Mom felt threatened and worked to isolate me so I'd stay dependent on her. I cried for the first time since Thanksgiving. Not angry tears, but the kind that come when you finally understand something that's been hurting you for years. Grace called me 3 weeks after she and Kevin started couples therapy. She sounded different on the phone, tired but less brittle than before. She told me their therapist was making them do exercises where they had to communicate without attacking each other, and it was the hardest thing she'd ever done. Kevin had admitted in their last session that part of him was angry at Grace for having a mother like Louise, which made no logical sense, but he couldn't help feeling it. The therapist said that kind of honesty was actually progress because they were finally saying the real things instead of the safe things. Grace asked if I thought they'd make it through this. I didn't know what to tell her because their marriage looked so broken from the outside, but I said if they were both still trying, then maybe that meant something. She went quiet for a minute and then told me Kevin had moved back into their bedroom the night before. Not because everything was fixed, but because they both decided they were tired of sleeping apart while trying to rebuild their marriage. She said it felt strange and familiar at the same time, like coming home to a house that had been rearranged while you were gone. Mom showed up at my office on a Tuesday morning exactly 4 weeks after the no-contact order went into effect. I was at my desk working on a report when the receptionist called saying someone was here to see me. I walked out to the lobby, and there she was holding a huge bouquet of roses and a card, her eyes already red like she'd been crying. She started talking before I could react, saying she just needed to apologize, that she'd made mistakes, but she was my mother, and didn't that count for something? My coworkers were staring, and I felt my face get hot with embarrassment and rage. I pulled out my phone and called the police while she kept talking, her voice getting louder and more desperate. She said I was being cruel, that Grace had poisoned me against her, that she'd given me everything, and this was how I repaid her. 2 officers arrived within 10 minutes, and I showed them the no-contact order. Mom's whole demeanor changed when she saw the police. She started crying harder and saying her children had abandoned her for no reason, that she was just a mother who loved too much. The officers weren't buying it. They asked her to come with them, and she refused, so they took her arms and started walking her toward the door. She screamed the whole way across the lobby that we'd regret this, that family was supposed to forgive each other, that she'd done nothing wrong. My boss came out of his office and asked if I was okay. I nodded, but I wasn't. I was shaking so hard I had to sit down in the lobby chair where Mom had been standing minutes before. The court hearing was scheduled for early March, 4 months after Thanksgiving. Grace and I drove there together while Kevin followed in his own car because he was testifying as a witness. We walked into the courthouse and saw Mom already sitting on a bench in the hallway. She was in a wheelchair that she absolutely did not need, wearing a cardigan that made her look frail and old, her hair styled to look thinner than it actually was. Grace grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. The bailiff called us into the courtroom and Mom's lawyer wheeled her to the front. The prosecutor presented all the evidence, the phone records, the messages to Kevin, the meetings with Bradley, the violation of the no-contact order at my workplace. Mom's lawyer argued she was suffering from early dementia and wasn't responsible for her actions. The judge looked at Mom and asked her directly if she understood why she was there. Mom said yes in a small voice and explained she'd just been trying to protect her daughter from a bad marriage. The judge's expression didn't change. He said the evidence showed a pattern of deliberate manipulation spanning months, and dementia didn't explain the level of planning involved. He granted restraining orders for me, Grace, James, and Kevin that would last 2 years. He gave her 2 years probation with mandatory psychiatric evaluation. If she violated any of the orders, she'd go to jail. Mom started crying and saying it wasn't fair, but the judge was already moving on to the next case. Dean called me a week after the hearing. His voice sounded hollow on the phone and he asked if he could come over to talk. He showed up at my apartment that evening carrying a single box of his belongings. He told me he'd filed for divorce that morning after 35 years of marriage. He was moving into a small apartment across town and wanted to apologize to each of us separately because a group apology felt too easy. He sat on my couch looking smaller than I'd ever seen him and said he knew sorry wasn't enough. He'd watched Mom manipulate and control us for decades and convinced himself it was just her personality, that it was harmless. He'd chosen to look away instead of protecting his children, and now he had to live with enabling everything that followed. I wanted to stay angry at him, but I could hear in his voice that he was genuinely broken. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, but he wanted us to know he was done making excuses for her. He was choosing us now, even though it was decades too late. After he left, I sat in the dark for an hour thinking about how many people had seen what Mom was doing and done nothing to stop it. My therapist helped me understand that Mom's sabotage wasn't about me being inadequate or unlovable. She explained that people like Louise need to control the people around them because it makes them feel powerful and important. When I formed my own relationships or made my own choices, it threatened her sense of control, so she worked to destroy anything that took my attention away from her. The therapist said understanding this wouldn't erase the damage Mom had caused, but it might help me stop blaming myself for her actions. We worked on identifying the patterns of manipulation, so I could recognize them if they showed up in other relationships. She taught me that healthy people don't punish you for having a life outside of them, and that needing space or independence doesn't make you selfish or ungrateful. I started keeping a journal of things I'd accomplished or relationships I'd built despite Mom's interference, and seeing it written down made me realize I was stronger than I'd given myself credit for. The damage was real, and it would take years to fully process, but at least now I understood it wasn't my fault. 6 months after Thanksgiving, Grace and Kevin renewed their vows in a small ceremony at a park near their house. It wasn't about pretending the damage hadn't happened or that everything was perfect now. It was about choosing each other again with full knowledge of how fragile trust could be and how much work it took to rebuild it. Grace wore a simple blue dress and Kevin's hands shook when he put the ring back on her finger. They'd written their own vows and Grace's voice broke when she promised to never let anyone come between them again, even family. Kevin promised to trust her enough to ask questions instead of believing the worst. Dean was there looking uncomfortable in a suit that didn't fit right anymore. James came alone because Sarah was still deciding about their marriage. Scarlett stood next to her parents in a flower crown, asking why everyone was crying. When Grace and Kevin kissed, everyone did cry because we all knew how hard they'd fought to get to this moment. The ceremony lasted maybe 20 minutes, but it felt more real than their original wedding 6 years ago, when none of us knew what Mom was capable of, or how much damage one person's obsession could cause. We gathered for Thanksgiving 1 year later at my apartment because Grace's house still felt contaminated by last year's memories. I'd spent 2 days cooking and cleaning, wanting everything to be perfect, even though perfect wasn't really the point. Dean arrived first carrying wine and looking nervous like he wasn't sure he'd be welcome. Grace and Kevin came with Scarlett, who'd grown at least 3 inches and wouldn't stop talking about her preschool teacher. James showed up alone because Sarah had decided to stay with her sister, while she figured out if their marriage could survive his months of secret contact with Mom. We sat around my small dining table that barely fit everyone, and passed dishes without mentioning the empty chair where Mom would have sat. Scarlett asked where Grandma was, and Grace told her simply that Grandma was sick and couldn't visit anymore. No one corrected her or added details because Scarlett was 5 now, and that was enough truth for a 5-year-old to carry. We talked about normal things like James's new job and Dean's apartment and Kevin's promotion at work. The conversation felt lighter without Mom's presence, like we could finally breathe without waiting for her to turn something innocent into ammunition. Nobody brought up the court case or the restraining orders or the divorce. That absence of her poison spreading through every interaction felt like the healthiest thing we'd done as a family in years. We were just existing together, damaged but trying, broken but not destroyed, and that was enough for now.